Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm basically going to talk you through all the different demand and supply side factors in different videos. So some of the bigger ones or more important factors, I'm going to dedicate their own video to them, so you can just go back and watch them by itself. So the exchange rate's the first one, and the exchange rate is both a demand and a supply side factor that can impact economic growth. So we're going to look at all of these things over the next couple of videos, but this one we're going to focus on exchange rates and then the terms of trade. This table is basically for you to work out whether things are demand and supply side factors, whether they're demand side factor or just a supply side factor. And something like productivity is always a supply side factor. The exchange rate. Well, what is the exchange rate? Well, it's the rate at which one currency can be exchanged for another. So basically it measures how much our Australian dollar is worth in comparison to other nations' countries. So if $1 Australian is $1 American dollar, basically means if I go off to America with my $1 Australian dollar, I can buy $1 American dollar. If $1 Australian is 90 US cents, then if I go off to America, I can only, if I exchange my dollar, I only get 90 cents. So if I'm going on holidays to America, I want the Australian dollar to be as high as possible. There's two main ways we measure the exchange rate. There's the compared to the US dollar, and we compare it to what we call the TWI, or the Trade Weighted Index. And we'll learn about that another time, but it's basically a measure of the value of the Australian dollar compared to a basket of our major trading partners, all weighted based on how much we trade with them, with China getting the highest weighting. So what effect does an appreciation of the Australian dollar have on economic growth? Well, firstly, if the dollar goes up, so $1 Australian, let's say, is buying now two US dollars. Well, $1 US will only buy 50 Australian cents. So exports become dearer for people overseas. Okay, if I'm selling a shirt for $50 to Americans, and then their dollar is now only worth half as much, it's going to cost them $100. Now that's not good for the Australian. This is really the critical thing. We're still only getting $50. We're still only getting 50 Australian dollars for that shirt. We're not getting $100, we're still only getting 50 when the dollar appreciates. But now that it's appreciated, the American is going to cost the American $100 US. So they're less likely to buy this shirt for $50. And we may have to lower the price to $40 or something like that to actually get them to buy the product. So when the dollar appreciates, exports are dearer to overseas buyers, reducing their purchasing power. So exports, X, goes down considerably. And imports become cheaper, and therefore we import more, leading to lower net exports, higher imports, less exports, and therefore lower production, because we're buying things from overseas and we're not selling as much to overseas countries. So not only does it lead to a reduction in X, and that's where you would start your answer, it also has flow-on impacts. So basically the flow-on impacts are that it can reduce consumption and investment expenditure. So with consumption expenditure, for example, if I'm an exporter, let's say I'm exporting minerals, or I'm in the tourism industry or the education industry, we're all going to suffer. So reduced wages, basically there's less people coming to Australia, and that's going to reduce wages in a lot of these export-related industries. And therefore there'll be less consumption because they're generating a lower wage. It also will hurt import competing businesses. And I really like answers that refer to these import competing industries. Because essentially if I'm selling something in Australia, so let's say I'm selling pens in Australia. If now the Australian dollar appreciates, people are more likely to go buy foreign pens because they're cheaper. So I might not be an exporter, I might just be selling Australian pens to Australians, but I'm also going to be affected because I'm competing with the cheap import. So consumption spending falls not only because export-related industries suffer, but because any industry that's competing against an import will also suffer. And that reduces factor incomes, or incomes earned from working, and leads to lower expenditure in the economy. Okay, so first thing, it leads to lower export spending, it leads to lower wages and consumption spending, and it also leads to less investment spending. Because, hey, if no one's buying our products, that's going to lead to lower profits and reduced investment spending for firms. If I can't sell my exports overseas, then I'm not going to be investing and trying to grow my business. So overall, exports, consumption and investment all fall, which leads to lower aggregate demand, lower production and lower real GDP. Make sure you make reference to import competing businesses and export related businesses as well. When you're talking about the higher dollar, and I'm not expecting this in your answers, but there are two forms of sellers. There's what we call price takers and price makers. And you remember this when we studied different types of market structures. But basically, in relation to the dollar, say someone like, if I'm a commodity working in the commodities industries, the price of commodities is set in world markets. So what that basically means is, let's say price of iron ore sells for $100 a tonne. That's not going to change if the value of the Australian dollar falls or rises, but the price of commodities is $100 US. Okay, it's all denominated in US currency. Then the Australian dollar appreciates. Well, when we sell these commodities for $100 US, now we're only going to get, say, 80 Australian dollars. So we actually suffer because we get less money. So it's not going to affect the demand for these products because they'll still be $100 US. But now that the Australian dollar is appreciated, when we convert that back to Australian dollars, we're only getting 80. So these people will get less money because when they sell each product, they're going to get less. Basically, we're going to get a lower price. So that's what a price taker is. They don't get to choose the price. Then we've got price makers. So for Australian firms, we set our own prices. So what happens is essentially, I'd say I run a hotel, so tourism would be an example of a price maker. My hotel, let's say it costs $200 a night. Well, when the Australian dollar appreciates, it's now going to cost the foreign citizen more. So in this case, the foreign citizen doesn't pay more, I just get less money. But in this case, the foreign citizen pays more, and therefore there'll be less demand for things like tourism and education. So price makers, we set the price, but the level of demand will fall because it'll be more expensive. And the other sufferers are the import competing businesses because they now face tougher competition from lower overseas costs, or the substitution effect will buy cheaper imports. That's all the demand side effect, and it's all negative with a higher dollar, and you need to be able to extrapolate that to the impacts of a lower dollar, which will obviously be positive. There'll be more exports because we're more competitive. There will be higher consumption, higher investment spending, and we're seeing that with tourism and education at the moment. Supply side impacts? Well, when the Australian dollar is supply side impacts of a higher dollar, that should say higher, my apologies, are that imports will be cheaper. So if we're using intermediate imports in production, then that's going to be cheaper. It'll lead to lower costs of production and an increased willingness for businesses to produce. So it's bad on the demand side, but good on the supply side. It'll lead to lower costs of production and cheaper costs per unit. This will shift the supply curve to the right and help stimulate growth. But overall, the negative impacts on demand from a higher dollar will outweigh the positive supply side benefits. So basically what would happen if I was to draw a graph, and we had initial supply and initial demand, initial supply, demand's going to go down, supply is going to go to the right, and we'll end up having a much lower price, but the impact on output will definitely be lower because demand will impact more than supply. Okay, just really quickly, I'll go through this really quickly. Explain how a higher exchange rate is likely to affect the goal of strong and sustainable economic growth. The value of the higher value of the Australian dollar is likely to make it more difficult to achieve the goal. Define the goal, 3 to 4%, strong enough for employment, inflation, external. As I said, always mention these factors. It's more difficult because the higher Australian dollar will reduce the international competitiveness of Australia's tradable sector, resulting in lower demand for exports and higher demand for imports. This is likely to reduce the incomes of those in export-related industries, reducing consumption and investment, making all the links I told you to make, exports, consumption, investment. There will be a small supply-side benefit due to lower costs of imports used in production. However, overall dual GDP is expected to fall. So define the goal, explain all the negatives, explain the slight positive, and your question. Thank you.